The streets of Millbrook looked exactly like I remembered them, which wasn't necessarily a good thing. 4 years away at college, and nothing had changed. Same cracked sidewalks, same faded storefronts with half the letters missing from their signs, same general sense that the whole town had given up trying around 1995. I drove past Miller's Hardware, no relation. Despite what people used to joke, and noticed the going out of business sign still hanging in the window. That sign had been there since my sophomore year of high school. My old Honda Civic felt out of place here, too clean and college-maintained compared to the pickup trucks and aging sedans parked along Main Street. A few people walked the sidewalks, but I knew that by 8 o'clock, the place would be completely empty. Millbrook rolled up tight after sunset, always has. Even as a kid, I'd noticed how quickly people got inside once the sun started going down. I turned onto Oak Street and felt that weird mix of familiarity and distance that comes with returning somewhere after being gone a long time. The massive oak trees still lined both sides of the road, their branches creating a tunnel of green overhead. Mrs. Henderson's house still needed a new fence. The Kowalski place still had that rusted swing set in the front yard, even though their kids had to be in their 20s by now. 3 blocks down, I pulled into the driveway of 1247 Oak Street. Home. The white paint on the shutters had peeled more than I remembered, and the front porch sagged a little on the left side, but otherwise the house looked the same. Solid. Familiar. A place where I'd spent 18 years before leaving for Ohio State and the wider world beyond. Catherine sat on the porch steps, waiting for me. My stomach dropped a little when I saw her. 4 months since my last visit, and the cancer had taken more out of her than I'd expected. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile, wrapped in a cardigan that used to fit her properly. Her hair had gone completely gray, and her skin had that translucent quality that made me think of old paper. But she smiled when she saw me, a real smile that reached her eyes and stood up with more energy than I'd expected. "You made good time," she said as I climbed out of the car. Traffic wasn't bad. I grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat and walked up the front steps. "What's up?" She hugged me, and I could feel how thin she'd gotten, all sharp angles and bird bones. "You look good." I lied. "You're a terrible liar, David." She laughed, but it turned into a cough that lasted longer than I liked. "Come on, I made dinner." Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and that sauce you used to ask for. The house smelled like tomatoes and garlic, mixed with the faint medicinal scent that had started lingering in the air during my last few visits. Catherine had set the dining room table with the good plates, the ones with the blue flowers that we only used for holidays or special occasions. 2 place settings, 2 glasses of water. A basket of bread she'd probably bought from the grocery store, but warmed up to make it seem homemade. We ate and talked about safe things, my classes, my graduation ceremony that she'd been too sick to attend, my plans for the job search now that I had a degree in computer science. She asked about my apartment in Columbus, about my roommate Jake, about whether I was eating enough vegetables. Normal mom questions, the kind that made everything feel regular and okay even when it wasn't. But I could tell she had something else on her mind. She kept glancing toward the windows, checking the clock on the mantel. The sun hadn't set yet, but it was getting close. And I recognized that particular tension in her shoulders that meant she was thinking about something serious. "David," she said as I helped her clear the dishes, "I know you're an adult now. I know 4 years of college taught you to think for yourself and question the things your parents told you. I loaded plates into the dishwasher and waited for her to continue. This felt like the beginning of a conversation I probably needed to pay attention to. But some of the rules we had when you were growing up, they're still important. They're still in effect as long as you're living in this house." Okay. I turned to face her, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Which rules are we talking about?" "All of them, but especially the big one. The one I made sure you understood before you were old enough to really question it." She met my eyes, and her expression was completely serious. Serious. "You don't go outside after dark. Not for any reason. Not to get something from the car, not to check the mail, not because you heard a noise or saw something. Once the sun goes down, you stay inside until morning." I felt a little embarrassed, honestly. Here I was, 22 years old with a college degree, and my mom was still treating me like I was 10 and might wander off into traffic. Mom, I think I can handle. Jessica Thompson broke that rule once, Catherine said, cutting me off. You remembered Jess. Of course I remembered Jess. Of course I remembered Jess. We'd been best friends until middle school. The kind of kids who rode bikes together and built forts in the backyard and made up elaborate games that lasted for hours. She used to call me Davy Boy in this silly voice that made me laugh, even when I tried to act annoyed by it. I'd had a massive crush on her that I'd been too young and stupid to do anything about. Yeah, I remember her. You were both 12. It was a Friday night in October, and her parents thought she was sleeping over at the Murphy house. But she snuck out instead, decided she wanted to see what all the fuss was about, why everyone in town was so serious about staying inside after dark. I remembered that night, actually. Not the details, but the aftermath. Jess had been weird for a week afterward. Jumpy, quiet, always looking over her shoulder like she expected something to grab her. She'd stopped calling me Davy Boy. She'd stopped calling me much of anything. She came back different, I said. She came back scared, really scared, David, the kind of scared that doesn't go away with time or therapy or rational explanations. Catherine's hands were shaking slightly as she dried a fork. Her family moved away a week later, packed up everything they owned, and left town in the middle of the night. No forwarding address, no goodbye. What happened to her out there? Catherine put the fork in the drawer and closed it with more force than necessary. That's not important. What's important is that you understand some rules exist for good reasons. Not because your parents want to control you or because we don't trust your judgment. Because some things are dangerous in ways that can't be explained or rationalized or fixed. I wanted to push for more details, but something in her tone told me the conversation was over. She looked exhausted suddenly, like talking about Jess had drained what little energy she had left. I'm going to bed, she said. Your room is exactly like you left it, clean sheets on the bed. I watched her walk slowly toward the stairs, one hand trailing along the wall for support. Mom? She turned back. I'll follow the rules. The relief on her face was so obvious that I felt guilty for not taking her seriously from the start. Whatever had happened to Jess, whatever Catherine thought was out there after dark, it mattered enough to her that she'd brought it up on my first night home. That had to count for something. An hour later, I was in my old bedroom, unpacking the clothes I'd brought for what I figured would be a few weeks, maybe a month at most. The room looked exactly the same. Same twin bed with the blue comforter, same desk where I'd done homework and played computer games, same bookshelf full of fantasy novels and science textbooks, even the same posters on the walls, though they looked smaller and more juvenile than I remembered. The heavy curtains over the windows caught my attention as I folded shirts into the dresser. They were thick, dark fabric that blocked out every trace of light from outside. I'd never really thought about them before, but now I realized how unusual they were. Most bedrooms had lighter curtains, something that let in a little bit of street light or morning sun. These looked like they were designed to create complete darkness, total separation from whatever was happening outside. I pulled one of the curtains aside and looked out at the backyard. The sun had set while I was unpacking, and the yard was dark except for the porch light Catherine had left on. Beyond the back fence, the woods that bordered our property looked completely black, impenetrable. I used to play in those woods all the time as a kid, before the rule about staying inside after dark became non-negotiable. Something moved between the trees, just at the edge of the porch light's reach. I leaned closer to the window, trying to make out what it was, but whatever I'd seen was gone. Probably just a deer or a raccoon, the kind of wildlife that came out at night in a small town like this. I let the curtain fall back into place and finished unpacking. Catherine was right about one thing. Some rules existed for good reasons. I just wished I understood what those reasons were. The laptop screen had become my constant companion over the past 3 days. I'd settled into a routine of sorts, working on job applications during the day while Catherine rested, helping her with meals when she felt up to eating, and spending the evenings hunched over the kitchen table with my computer. The familiar blue glow of the monitor felt like my connection to the outside world, to the life I'd built in Columbus that was waiting for me to figure out what came next. Catherine had gone to bed early again, around 9:30. I could hear her upstairs, the labored breathing that had gotten worse since my first night home. The treatments weren't helping much anymore. And we both knew it, though neither of us had said it out loud. She'd started taking longer naps during the day, and her appetite had dropped to almost nothing. I'd been researching hospice care options between job applications, trying to prepare myself for conversations I didn't want to have. The kitchen felt too quiet, with just the soft humming of the refrigerator and the occasional click of my keyboard. I'd been working on a cover letter for a software company in Cleveland, trying to explain why I wanted to relocate from Ohio State's college town to somewhere closer to home. The truth was complicated, and I couldn't exactly write that my mom was dying, and I needed to be near enough to help, but far enough away to still have a life. The cursor blinked at the end of an unfinished sentence when everything went black. The laptop screen died instantly, taking the gentle light with it. The refrigerator's humming stopped mid-cycle. Even the digital clock on the microwave went dark, leaving me sitting in complete darkness so sudden it felt like someone had thrown a blanket over my head. I fumbled for my phone, muscle memory guiding my fingers to the flashlight function. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar kitchen in harsh white light that made everything look strange and unfamiliar. I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum, and walked to the front window. The whole street was dark. Miller's house across the way, the Henderson place next door, even the street lamps that usually cast yellow pools of light along Oak Street. All of it had gone black. Keen, black. Through the trees I could make out the faint outline of houses on the next block over, equally dark and lifeless. A neighborhood-wide outage then, probably a transformer blown somewhere, or maybe the old electrical grid finally giving up. These things happened in small towns, especially during the summer when everyone was running air conditioners. I'd lived through plenty of power outages as a kid, usually lasting a few hours at most. I needed to check how far the outage extended. If it was just our block, I could call the utility company and get an estimated repair time. If it covered more area, we might be looking at a longer wait. Catherine would need her breathing machine if the power stayed off too long. The front door unlocked easily under my hand, and I stepped outside onto the porch without thinking about it. Just a quick look to see if the outage went down to Main Street. So maybe check if any of the neighbors were outside, doing the same thing. The night air hit me like stepping into a sealed room. No breeze at all. Not even the faint stirring that usually moves through the oak trees. The temperature felt wrong, too. Not quite hot, but heavy in a way that made my clothes stick to my skin. I walked down the front steps and out toward the street, holding my phone up to extend the flashlight's reach. That's when I noticed the silence, not just quiet, actual silence. No crickets chirping in the grass, ni stipag in the grass. No rustling leaves, no distant hum of cars on the main road. Even my own footsteps on the concrete seemed muffled, like the sound was being absorbed before it could travel. I stopped walking and held my breath, listening for anything that would prove the world hadn't just died around me. Nothing. I turned in a slow circle, sweeping the phone's light across the street, the neighboring houses, the dark windows that stared back like empty eyes. Everything looked normal, but felt completely wrong, like a photograph of my neighborhood instead of the actual place. Help me. The voice came from behind the house, somewhere in the direction of the woods that bordered our backyard. A woman's voice, clear but distant, carrying that particular tone people get when they're scared and trying not to panic. Please somebody help me. I'm lost. I walked back toward the house, around the side where the driveway met the backyard. The voice was definitely coming from the tree line, maybe 50 yards away from where the mowed grass ended and the forest began. My phone's light couldn't reach that far, but I could make out the dark wall of trees, impenetrable and waiting. I can't find my way back, the voice called. I've been walking for hours. Something about the voice nagged at me. Not just familiar, but specifically familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. The pitch, the way certain words were pronounced, the particular breathiness that came through even when the speaker was trying to project across distance. Hello, I called back, immediately feeling stupid for responding, but unable to stop myself. Where are you? I'm here, the voice answered, and now I was sure I recognized it. I'm in the woods. I can see your light, the way she said certain words. Nini. The slight accent that made here sound like hiai and dropped the R in your almost completely. I'd grown up hearing that voice, spent countless afternoons listening to it laugh and joke and call my name across playground equipment and backyard games. Davy boy, is that you? My blood went cold. Nobody had called me that since middle school. Nobody except Jess. Oh, thank God, Davy boy. I knew you'd recognize me. The relief in her voice sounded genuine, desperate in a way that made me want to help despite every rational thought telling me this was impossible. I got turned around somehow. Everything looks different in the dark. I took a step toward the woods, then stopped. The voice was definitely coming from the trees, but something about it felt off in a way I couldn't identify. Too clear, maybe, for someone calling across 50 yards of open space. Or maybe too perfectly what I expected Jess to sound like, as if someone was performing an impression rather than actually being her. How did you get here? I called, but I got lost trying to find your house in the dark. The explanation made sense, except for one thing. If Jess had come back to visit, if she'd been looking for my house, she would have come to the front door. She wouldn't have been wandering around in the woods behind our property, especially not at night. Especially not when she'd been the kid who broke the rule about going outside after dark and came back scared enough that her family left town. Davy boy, please. The voice continued, and now there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. I'm scared. I can't find my way out. The nickname hit me like a physical blow. She'd called me that in her silly, affectionate way that had made me feel special and embarrassed at the same time. The way she said it now was perfect. Exactly right, but somehow that made it worse. Too right. Too much like my memory of it. I backed toward the house, my phone's light wobbling as my hand started to shake. I need to get my mom. I called toward the woods. She can help us figure out. No, the voice snapped sharp and immediate. Don't leave me alone out here. Please, Davy boy, just come help me find the path back. The tone had changed completely. Still, Jess's voice, still using the nickname that only she had ever used, but with an undertone that made my skin crawl, demanding instead of pleading, angry that I wasn't doing what it wanted. What it wanted, not what she wanted. I ran, sprinted across the backyard and up the porch steps, fumbling with the door handle as the voice behind me changed again, becoming louder, more insistent, calling my name over and over with increasing frustration. The deadbolt turned under my shaking fingers, and I slammed the door hard enough to rattle the frame. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I turned the lock and checked it twice. The house felt safe and solid around me, but I could still hear the voice outside, fainter now but persistent, calling for Davy boy to come back and help. I pressed my back against the door and tried to slow my breathing. Whatever was out there in the woods, it knew things it shouldn't know. It knew my childhood nickname, knew how Jess had sounded when she said it, knew exactly what to say to make me want to help. But it wasn't Jess. Jess had left town 12 years ago, and whatever had scared her badly enough to make her family disappear in the middle of the night was still out there, still waiting in the dark between the trees. I woke up with my cheek pressed against cold linoleum, and every muscle in my body protesting the night I'd spent curled against the back door. My neck felt like someone had twisted it into a pretzel, and my right arm had gone completely numb from being trapped under my ribs for hours. The kitchen looked normal in the morning light streaming through the windows, dishwasher humming quietly, coffee maker blinking its ready signal, refrigerator displaying the time in blue digital numbers. The power was back on. Everything worked exactly like it should, as if the complete blackout had never happened. David, I jerked upright, my spine popping in 3 places as Catherine appeared in the kitchen doorway. She wore her blue bathrobe and house slippers, hair messed from sleep, but her eyes were completely alert. She took in the scene, me on the floor in yesterday's clothes, the deadbolt turned, my phone lying next to me with a dead battery. Her face went white. Tell me you didn't go outside last night. Her voice came out flat, carefully controlled in a way that made my stomach drop. Tell me you stayed inside like I asked. I couldn't lie to her, not when she looked like that. Not when the fear in her eyes was so obvious it made the air in the kitchen feel thick and hard to breathe. I went out for maybe 5 minutes, I said, pushing myself up to sitting position. The power went out and I wanted to see how far the outage extended. I just stepped onto the porch and walked to the street. Catherine's hands started shaking. She gripped the doorframe, knuckles white against the painted wood, and, for a second I thought she might collapse right there. What did you see? She asked. What did you hear? The memory of the voice hit me again. That perfect imitation of Jess calling my name with the nickname only she had ever used. The way it had sounded exactly right but felt completely wrong, like listening to a recording of someone who died years ago. Someone called for help from the woods. I said, Theodore. A woman's voice. She said she was lost, asked me to come help her find her way back. Catherine closed her eyes and leaned heavily against the doorframe. When she opened them again, she looked older, more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Did you recognize the voice? I nodded, even though part of me wanted to pretend I hadn't. It sounded like Jess. She called me Davy Boy. Catherine made a sound that was part sob, part something else entirely. She walked to the kitchen counter with unsteady steps and began making coffee with movements that seemed automatic, muscle memory taking over while her mind dealt with whatever I'd just told her. The coffee grounds scattered across the counter as her hand shook, and she had to start over twice before managing to get the filter in place. Mom, what's going on? I stood up slowly, working the kinks out of my neck. What happened to me last night? You almost died. She said it matter-of-factly, like she was commenting on the weather. If you'd walked into those woods, if you'd followed that voice calling your name, you would have disappeared completely. And within a week, maybe less, I wouldn't remember you ever existed. The coffee maker started its brewing cycle, filling the silence between us with familiar burbling sounds that seemed absurdly normal given what Catherine had just said. I watched her lean against the counter, supporting herself with both hands, and realized this conversation was going to change everything between us. That's not possible, I said. But even as the words came out, I knew they sounded weak. Something had been wrong about last night, wrong in ways that rational explanations couldn't cover. The Thompson family lived 3 houses down from us for 8 years. Catherine continued, ignoring my protest. Jess was your best friend from kindergarten through 6th grade. You two were inseparable, always getting into trouble together, always planning some new adventure. She turned to face me, and her eyes had that distant look people get when they're remembering something painful. The night she broke the rule and went outside after dark, she came back different, scared in a way that therapy couldn't fix, medicine couldn't touch. Her parents tried everything, but nothing helped. Catherine poured coffee into 2 mugs, her movements careful and deliberate. She handed me one and wrapped her fingers around the other, like she was trying to warm them. A week later, they packed up everything they owned and left town in the middle of the night. No forwarding address, no goodbye. No explanation to their neighbors or friends. They just vanished. You told me this already, I said. The night I got home. What I didn't tell you was what happened after they left. And Catherine took a sip of coffee and looked out the kitchen window toward the backyard, toward the tree line where I'd heard the voice calling, Kiani. Within a month, people started forgetting they'd ever lived here. The Hendersons forgot they used to babysit Jess when her parents worked late. Your 2nd grade teacher forgot that Jess had been in your class. Even you started having trouble remembering details about her, didn't you? About her, didn't you? I wanted to argue, but she was right. My memories of Jess had always felt strangely vague, like trying to remember a dream weeks after waking up. I could recall the general shape of our friendship, the fact that we'd been close, but specific moments had faded in ways that didn't make sense for someone who'd been such an important part of my childhood. The thing in the woods takes people, Catherine said quietly, and then it takes the memory of them too. That's how it's always worked in this town. That's why we have the rule about staying inside after dark. Catherine set her coffee mug on the counter and walked to the kitchen window. She stood there for a long time, looking out at the backyard, at the fence that separated our property from the woods beyond. Her shoulders were tense, and I could see her reflection in the glass, the worry lines around her eyes deeper than they'd been the day before. This has been happening for generations, I asked. Longer than that, since before this town was officially founded. She pressed her palm against the window glass, leaving a foggy handprint. Every family that's lived here for more than a few years knows about it. We all follow the same rules. We all protect our children the same way, and we all hope it never targets someone we love. The implications hit me like cold water. Every family, every longtime resident, an entire community living with the knowledge that something hunted in the darkness just beyond their backyards, something that could make people disappear so completely that their very existence would be erased from memory. Why doesn't anyone leave? I asked. Will anyone leave? Why stay somewhere like this? Catherine turned away from the window and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Sadness, maybe, or resignation. Where would we go? This thing, whatever it is, it's tied to this place. But some of us are tied to it too, in ways we don't fully understand. Your father tried to move us away when you were 10. We made it as far as the county line before the car broke down. 3 different mechanics couldn't find anything wrong with it, but it wouldn't start. We had to call a tow truck to bring us back. She walked to the kitchen table and sat down heavily, like the conversation had drained what little energy she had left. I need you to understand how serious this is, David. Last night, when you heard that voice, when it called you by the nickname only Jess ever used, that wasn't a coincidence. It's been watching you, learning about you, preparing to hunt you specifically. The coffee tasted bitter in my mouth, but I kept drinking it because I needed something to do with my hands. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, like the walls had moved closer together while we talked. You said people disappear completely, I said, but Jess didn't disappear. She left town with her family. Because her parents got her out fast enough. Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. Because they recognized what was happening and didn't wait around to see how much worse it could get. But if they'd stayed, if they'd given it more time to work on her, she shook her head. Jess would have gone back to the woods eventually. The thing out there is patient and it knows how to wait for the right moment. Catherine stood up and walked back to the window, pressing both hands against the glass now. From where I sat, I could see her reflection and the view beyond, our backyard, the fence, the tree line where I'd heard the voice calling my name with words only one person had ever used. I don't know how much time we have, she said. Sometimes it hunts people for weeks before making its move. Sometimes it strikes within days. But now that it's targeted you, now that it knows you'll respond to that particular voice calling that particular name, it won't stop until you either leave town or make another mistake. The weight of what she was telling me settled like a stone in my chest. Knee in my chest. I'd come home to help my mother through her illness, to spend what might be her final months in the place where I'd grown up. Instead, I'd walked into something that had been waiting in the darkness since before I was born. Something that had already marked me as prey. Promise me you won't go outside after dark. Catherine said, still looking out the window, promise me you won't listen if you hear voices calling your name, no matter how familiar they sound or how much they make you want to help. I promise, I said, and meant it. But even as I spoke the words, I could see her hands trembling against the window glass, could hear the fear in her breathing that she was trying to hide. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine terror in my mother's eyes. And I realized that her rules hadn't been about protecting a child from normal dangers. They'd been about protecting me from something that hunted in the spaces between memory and nightmare. Something that knew exactly which voices to use to make me walk willingly into the dark. I spent the rest of the morning helping Catherine with small tasks around the house, but I could tell she was working up to something. She moved through her routine with a distracted air, checking and rechecking things that didn't need checking, glancing at me when she thought I wasn't looking. Around noon, she barely touched the sandwich I made her, pushing the plate around on the table while staring out the kitchen window. There's more I need to show you, she finally said, setting down her untouched food. Things I should have explained years ago before you went away to college. She stood up slowly, gripping the table edge for support. And I could see the effort it took for her to stay upright. The morning's conversation had drained her more than usual, leaving her looking fragile in a way that made my chest tighten with worry. Mom, you should rest. We can talk about this later. No. Her voice came out firm, stronger than her physical appearance suggested. If I wait, I might not have the energy tomorrow. And you need to understand what you're dealing with before another night comes. Catherine led me to the basement door, her hand shaking slightly as she turned the old brass knob. The wooden steps creaked under our weight as we descended into the cool, dim space that smelled of concrete and old cardboard. I hadn't been down here since high school, when I'd occasionally retrieved Christmas decorations or helped move storage boxes around. The basement looked exactly like I remembered it. Concrete walls painted white decades ago, now yellowed and peeling in spots, a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and metal shelving units lined with boxes labeled in Catherine's careful handwriting, "Ini." But instead of heading toward the holiday decorations or seasonal clothes, she walked to the far corner where an old wooden filing cabinet sat against the wall. Catherine pulled a small key from her pocket and unlocked the top drawer, which slid open with a rusty screech. Inside, instead of the tax documents or insurance papers I expected, she pulled out a thick manila folder that looked like it had been handled countless times over many years. "Every family in Millbrook keeps records like these," she said, setting the folder on top of an overturned cardboard box that served as a makeshift table, passed down from parents to children generation after generation after generation. "We all know the story, but we rarely talk about it. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share casually." She opened the folder carefully, revealing a collection of yellowed newspaper clippings, handwritten letters, and what looked like copied pages from old books. The papers had that brittle, aged quality of documents that had been stored for decades, their edges brown and fragile. Catherine lifted the first item, a newspaper clipping so old the print had faded to brown ink on cream-colored paper. The masthead read, "The Pioneer Weekly," and the date showed February 15, 1847. "This is where it started," she said, pointing to a headline that read, "Blackwood Family Missing from Homestead." I leaned closer to read the article, squinting to make out the faded text. The story described a family of 5 who had settled on land about 3 miles from what would eventually become Millbrook's town center. They'd built a cabin and cleared farmland during the summer of 1846, preparing for their first winter in the area. But when spring arrived, neighboring settlers found their homestead abandoned, with no sign of what had happened to them. The official story was that they probably died during the winter, Catherine said, lifting another clipping dated a few weeks later. "Harsh weather, poor preparation, maybe illness." It happened to other families back then. The second article described search efforts that had found evidence of the Blackwood cabin being occupied through most of the winter. Chopped wood, food stores, signs of recent habitation. But the family themselves had vanished without a trace, leaving behind personal belongings and livestock that should have been too valuable to abandon. Catherine set both clippings aside and pulled out a handwritten letter. The paper so delicate it looked like it might crumble if handled roughly. The writing was in careful script, brown ink on paper that had once been white. "This is from a man named Samuel Morrison, who was part of the search party," she said. "He wrote this letter to his brother back east, describing what they actually found at the Blackwood homestead." I read over her shoulder, making out the careful cursive that described the search in detail. Morrison wrote about finding the cabin intact, but showing signs of what he called unnatural habitation. Furniture had been arranged in strange patterns. Personal belongings scattered in ways that suggested panic or violence, and disturbing marks carved into the wooden walls that looked like symbols or crude writing. But the most unsettling discovery had been in the cellar beneath the cabin. Morrison's letter described finding human bones, clearly not belonging to the Blackwood family based on their number and condition. The bones showed marks that suggested they had been deliberately cleaned of flesh, and there were far too many to represent just 5 missing people. The search party found evidence that the Blackwoods had been surviving by hunting other travelers. Catherine said quietly, "People passing through the area who stopped at their cabin for shelter or directions. They'd been capturing and killing them throughout the winter." Catherine pulled out another document, this one written in a different hand on newer paper, a copy of what looked like an official report written decades later. The heading identified it as testimony collected in 1923 from elderly residents who remembered stories passed down from the original settlers. "This is where the story gets stranger," Catherine continued. "According to the old-timers, the last person the Blackwoods captured wasn't just a random traveler." I read the copied testimony, which described a woman who had been seen traveling alone through the area in late February of 1847. Several witnesses mentioned that she carried herself differently from other travelers, more confident, less concerned about the dangers of winter travel. Some described her as speaking in languages they didn't recognize or carrying items that seemed unusual for a simple traveler. The testimony suggested that this woman had stayed with the Blackwood family for several days before disappearing like the others. But unlike the previous victims, her disappearance had been followed by strange occurrences that the surviving settlers couldn't explain. They called her a witch, Catherine said, pointing to a particular passage in the testimony. Whether she actually was or not doesn't matter. What matters is what happened after they killed her. According to the old stories, the woman had spoken words in an unknown language as she died, words that seemed to hang in the air long after her voice stopped. Within days, neighbors reported seeing lights moving through the woods around the Blackwood homestead and strange sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When another search party finally returned to the cabin in early spring, they found it completely empty, not just of people but of everything. The furniture, the belongings, even the bones they'd discovered in the cellar had all vanished. The cabin itself remained standing, but it felt wrong in ways the searchers couldn't describe. Catherine pulled out a final document, this one more recent but still decades old. It was a map of the area drawn in the 1920s, showing the location of the original Blackwood homestead in relation to where Millbrook was eventually built. The town founders knew about the story, she said, tracing a line from the marked homestead to the current town boundaries. They chose this location partly because it was far enough from the original site to feel safe, but close enough to keep watch over it. The map showed that the Blackwood homestead sat right at the edge of what was now the wooded area behind our house. The cabin was long gone. But the land where it had stood was less than a quarter-mile from where I'd heard the voice calling my name 2 nights ago. The first families to settle here noticed things, Catherine continued, setting the map aside. Voices calling from the woods at night, always sounding like people they knew, always asking for help or directions. Anyone who responded would disappear completely, usually within a few days. She pulled out a small notebook filled with handwritten entries in different scripts, apparently maintained by multiple people over many years. The entries read like a record of disappearances with names, dates, and brief descriptions of circumstances. It built them in sense. 1851, Thomas Henley, age 16, responded to calls from Woods claiming to be his missing brother. Found gone from bedroom next morning, family forgot his existence within 1 week. 1864, Martha Collins, age 23, went outside after hearing children crying in forest. Horse found 3 days later. No memory of Martha among town residents. 1889, Jacob and Ruth Weber, both age 19, disappeared after investigating sounds of injured animal near tree line. Wedding planned for following month canceled when no one could remember whose ceremony was intended for. The entries continued chronologically, documenting decades of disappearances that followed the same pattern. People heard voices or sounds from the woods that compelled them to investigate. They vanished without a trace, and within days their existence was erased from local memory. Every long-term family in Millbrook knows about this, Catherine said, closing the notebook. We've all lost relatives or friends over the years. That's why we have the rule about staying inside after dark. It's the only protection that's ever worked consistently. I stared at the collection of documents spread across the makeshift table, trying to process what Catherine had just shown me. The evidence was overwhelming, spanning nearly 2 centuries and documented by multiple independent sources. This wasn't folklore or superstition. It was a carefully maintained historical record of something that had been hunting people in these woods since before the Civil War. The thing that called to you the other night, Catherine said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. That's what's left of the Blackwood family. The curse that woman spoke as she died, it changed them into something that can't rest, can't move on, can't do anything except hunt for new victims to replace what they lost. The realization hit me like cold water. Jess hadn't just encountered some random supernatural entity when she broke the rule as a child. She'd come face to face with something that had been hunting in these woods for over 170 years, something that had perfected its ability to lure people to their deaths by using the voices of people they trusted. That's why she was so scared, I said, more to myself than to Catherine. She actually saw them and lived to tell about it. Catherine added, most people who encounter them directly don't make it back. Jess was lucky or smart or both, but the experience marked her in ways that couldn't be healed, and her parents were smart enough to recognize the danger of staying. Catherine began carefully returning the documents to the folder, handling each piece of paper like it was made of glass. Her movements were slow and deliberate, but I could see her hands shaking with exhaustion. Now that it's targeted you specifically, she said, not looking up from the papers, it's not going to stop. These things are patient. They can wait weeks or months for the right opportunity. They'll keep using that voice, keep calling your name with words only Jess ever used until they find a way to make you respond. The weight of what she was telling me settled in my chest like a stone. I come home to help my dying mother, expecting to deal with illness and grief and the normal challenges of loss. Instead, I discovered that I was being hunted by something that had been perfecting its killing methods since before my great-grandparents were born. Why didn't you tell me this before? I asked. When I was growing up or when I left for college. Catherine closed the folder and locked it back in the filing cabinet, the key disappearing into her pocket. She turned to look at me. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the toll that maintaining these secrets had taken over the years. Because knowing makes you a target, she said simply. Children who grow up with the rule but don't know the reason behind it are safer than children who understand exactly what they're hiding from. Knowledge draws attention, and attention from these things is the last thing you want. We climbed the basement stairs in silence, Catherine moving slowly and pausing twice to catch her breath. The normal afternoon light in the kitchen felt strange after the dim basement, like returning to the surface after being underwater. Catherine sat down heavily at the kitchen table and closed her eyes, clearly exhausted by the effort of showing me the documents and explaining their significance. I made her a cup of tea and set it within reach, though I doubted she'd have the energy to drink much of it. So what to do now? I asked, sitting across from her. How do I protect myself from something like that? Follow the rules, she said without opening her eyes. Stay inside after dark. Don't respond to voices calling from the woods. And if you hear them getting closer to the house, don't assume the walls will keep you safe forever. The last part sent a chill down my spine. You think they might try to get inside? I think they're getting stronger, Catherine said, finally opening her eyes to look at me. The attacks used to be limited to the deepest part of the woods, only targeting people who ventured far from town, but you heard that voice from our backyard. Close enough to our house that it could see the porch light. Catherine reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers cold and trembling. Promise me that if anything happens to me, if I get worse quickly or don't make it through this illness, you'll leave town immediately. Don't wait for the funeral. Don't worry about settling my affairs. Just pack your car and drive away as fast as you can. Mom promised me, David. These things have been watching our family for years because we know their history. If you're here alone, without me to help maintain the protections around this house, you'll be completely vulnerable. I squeezed her hand, feeling how thin and fragile it had become. I promise. But even as I said the words, I could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear that promises might not be enough to keep me safe from something that had been hunting successfully for over 2 centuries. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon was fading toward evening, and I found myself dreading the approach of another night. I woke up before dawn with my mind already made up. The conversation with Catherine yesterday, seeing all those documents, learning the true scope of what we were dealing with, it had crystallized something that had been building since I heard that voice calling my name. I needed to get out of Millbrook, and I needed to do it now. Catherine was still sleeping when I crept upstairs to my room and started pulling clothes from the dresser drawers. My duffel bag sat open on the bed as I stuffed everything inside without bothering to fold anything properly. T-shirts, jeans, underwear, the few dress shirts I'd brought home. All of it went into the bag in a jumbled mess that would have made my college roommate laugh at how quickly I'd abandoned any pretense of organization. My laptop went into its carrying case along with the charger and the notebook where I'd been writing down job prospects. The fantasy novels and textbooks could stay. Nothing in those pages was worth risking my life over. I grabbed my phone charger, toothbrush, the bottle of ibuprofen from the bathroom medicine cabinet, and the emergency cash I kept tucked in my wallet. The whole process took maybe 20 minutes. Everything I actually needed fit into one bag and a laptop case, which said something about how little I'd accumulated during 4 years of college, or maybe about how fast you could move when genuine fear motivated your decisions. Catherine's breathing sounded labored even through her closed bedroom door as I carried my things downstairs. Part of me wanted to wake her up, to explain what I was doing and why I couldn't wait any longer. But she'd already made it clear that she understood the danger, and she'd specifically told me to leave if staying put me at risk. The entity had targeted me directly, and every night I remained in this house increased the chances that I'd eventually make a mistake that would get me killed. I loaded my bags into the Honda's trunk, moving quietly to avoid disturbing the neighbors who might wonder why someone was packing up and leaving at 5:30 in the morning. The car keys felt cold in my hand as I slid into the driver's seat and adjusted the rearview mirror. Through the windshield, I could see the familiar outline of the house where I'd grown up, the same white shutters and sagging front porch that had been there when I was 12 and learned about rules that couldn't be broken. I turned the key in the ignition. Nothing happened. The engine didn't turn over, didn't make any sound at all. No clicking, no grinding, no indication that the starter was even trying to engage. The dashboard lights came on normally when I turned the key to the accessory position, showing that the battery was fine. But the moment I tried to start the engine, I got complete silence. I tried again, holding the key longer this time, and pressing the gas pedal in case the engine was flooded. Still nothing. The radio worked. The air conditioning came on when I tested it, and all the electrical systems seemed functional, but the car refused to start. This was the same Honda that had driven me 4 hours from Columbus without any problems 3 days ago. So, the same car that had started perfectly every morning since I'd owned it, even in the dead of winter when I had to scrape ice off the windshield. Now when I needed it most, it had chosen to break down in a way that made no mechanical sense. I popped the hood and walked around to look at the engine, though I knew I wouldn't be able to diagnose anything serious. The battery terminals looked clean and tight, all the belts appeared intact, and I didn't see any obvious leaks or disconnected wires. Everything looked exactly like it should in a car that had been running fine the day before. Back inside the house, I found the phone book in the kitchen drawer and looked up local auto repair shops. Miller's Automotive had been in business since I was a kid, and they opened at 7 a.m., according to their advertisement. I called as soon as the clock hit 7, explaining to the mechanic who answered that my car wouldn't start and asking when they could take a look at it. "Soonest I can get to you is Thursday," he said, without checking any schedule. "We're backed up with 3 other jobs that came in yesterday, plus a transmission rebuild that's taking longer than expected." Thursday was 3 days away. I asked if he knew anyone else in town who might be available sooner, but he just laughed and said Miller's was the only shop within 30 miles that handled anything more complicated than oil changes. "You try the rental place," he suggested. "Might be easier than waiting for us to get to your car." I thanked him and hung up, already dialing the number for Enterprise Rent-A-Car in the next town over. The woman who answered sounded apologetic but firm when she told me they had no vehicles available for the rest of the week. "We've had an unusual number of rentals this month," she explained. "Normally we keep a few cars in reserve, but everything's out right now. You might try Budget though, I think they're in the same situation." Budget confirmed what the Enterprise agent had predicted. No cars available until the following Monday at the earliest. The man I spoke with mentioned that they'd had several customers cancel their reservations at the last minute, but all those vehicles had already been rented to other people within hours of becoming available. Greyhound had a station in Millbrook, though I'd never paid attention to where it was located or what their schedule looked like. Information told me the number, and I called expecting to at least find a bus that could get me as far as the nearest city with an airport. All outbound routes are suspended until further notice, the woman at the station told me. Road construction started up Monday night on the main highway, and they've got it torn up so bad that buses can't get through. Dot says it'll be at least a week before they're finished. I asked about alternate routes, maybe a bus that went north or south instead of east toward Columbus. She checked her computer and made a sympathetic noise. Everything goes through that same stretch of highway eventually. Construction's got the whole area bottlenecked. You might try calling back next week to see if they've made better progress than expected. Road construction that had started Monday night The same day I'd heard the voice calling from the woods. The same night the power had gone out across the whole neighborhood for hours, leaving me vulnerable to whatever was hunting in the darkness between the trees. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone in my hand, staring at the list of numbers I'd called without success. Every possible way out of Millbrook had been systematically blocked within the span of a few days, each obstacle appearing just as I discovered I needed to leave. Car trouble, no rental vehicles, transportation routes suddenly closed for construction. Well, it was like watching a trap close around me, one piece at a time. Catherine appeared in the doorway wearing her bathrobe and house slippers, moving slowly but with more alertness in her eyes than I'd seen in days. She took in the scene, me sitting at the table with the phone, my bags visible through the doorway in the front hall, the frustrated expression I couldn't hide. "Car won't start," she asked, among other things. Oh, I told her about the phone calls, the rental agencies with no vehicles, the bus routes closed for construction that had appeared overnight. Catherine listened without interrupting, but I could see something shifting in her expression, a recognition that went beyond simple concern. "This has happened before," she said when I finished. Not to us, but to other families over the years. When someone who knows the truth tries to leave town suddenly, especially someone the entity has targeted directly. Catherine walked to the coffee maker and started a pot brewing, her movements automatic while her mind worked through whatever she was remembering. "Your father told me about a family in the 1980s, she continued. The Kowalskis, their teenage son had broken the after-dark rule and survived, but he was so traumatized that his parents decided to move away immediately. Their car broke down at the town limits. The moving truck they'd hired got a flat tire that couldn't be repaired. Even the taxi they called to take them to the airport never showed up. The company claimed they'd never received a call." The coffee maker started its familiar gurgling, filling the silence while I processed what Catherine was telling me. The entity wasn't just hunting people who wandered into the woods at night. It was actively working to keep its targets within reach, manipulating circumstances to prevent escape. "How long did the Kowalskis stay trapped?" I asked. 2 weeks. Their son disappeared on the 14th night. Catherine's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The family left town the next morning, but by then they couldn't remember why they'd been trying to leave or what had happened to make them want to move away. The implications hit me like cold water. I wasn't just dealing with something that hunted at night. I was dealing with something intelligent enough to orchestrate mechanical failures, influence business availability, and coordinate construction projects to create the perfect conditions for prolonged stalking. "We should call the police," I said, though even as I spoke the words I knew how absurd they sounded. "Report the car as vandalized or file a complaint about the construction blocking transportation." Catherine looked at me with an expression that mixed sympathy with resignation. "The police chief grew up here, David. His family's been in Millbrook for 4 generations. He knows exactly what's happening, and he knows there's nothing law enforcement can do about it." She poured coffee into 2 mugs and handed me one, the warmth feeling good against my hands even though the kitchen wasn't particularly cold. "The best thing we can do is maintain the protections around the house and wait for an opportunity," she said. "Sometimes the entity's attention shifts to other potential targets or it gets distracted by changes in the season. But trying to force an escape when it's actively blocking your path will only make you more vulnerable." I spent the rest of the day trying to find alternative solutions, calling friends from college to see if anyone could drive up and give me a ride back to Columbus. But every plan I came up with ran into unexpected obstacles. Jake, my former roommate, was supposed to drive up that afternoon but called around noon to say his car had broken down. Another friend agreed to take a bus to Millbrook and then rent a car for both of us. But when he called from the bus station, he discovered that all the rental agencies were now claiming they had no vehicles available for another 2 weeks. By late afternoon, I'd accepted that I wasn't leaving Millbrook anytime soon. The entity had created a web of obstacles that seemed to anticipate every possible escape route, leaving me trapped in a town where something had been hunting successfully for over 170 years. Whoa. As the sun started to set, I found myself at the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where I'd heard Jess's voice calling my name 2 nights ago. The familiar view looked different somehow, more threatening, like I was looking at a stage where I'd been cast in a role I didn't want to play. Catherine joined me at the window, her breathing more labored than it had been that morning. She pointed toward the street, where I could see that several of the street lights had burned out since the previous night. That started happening about an hour ago, she said. Nah. First the one in front of the Henderson place, then the one by the stop sign, then the two down by the corner. The burned-out lights created dark pockets between the ones that still worked. Areas where someone walking down the sidewalk would pass through pools of shadow that hadn't existed the night before. It was subtle, but deliberate, like someone was systematically removing the barriers that made people feel safe moving around the neighborhood after dark. From where we stood, I could see the tree line at the back of our property, the woods where the Blackwood homestead had once stood. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper than usual, and I caught glimpses of movement. That didn't match the gentle breeze moving through the branches. Do you hear that? Catherine asked. I listened carefully, filtering out the normal evening sounds of settling houses and distant traffic. Underneath those familiar noises, I could make out voices calling from multiple directions. Not just one voice like the night I'd first heard them, but several coming from different points along the tree line. Davy boy, where are you? David, come help us. We're lost, David. We can't find our way back. The voices used different tones and inflections, but they all knew my name. All carried that same quality of desperate pleading that had compelled me to step outside 2 nights ago. Catherine and I stood at the window, listening to the calls echo between the houses and through the neighborhood streets. They're getting closer, Catherine observed. Last night they stayed at the edge of the woods. Tonight they're calling from the street, from between the houses. As if responding to her words, a voice called out from what sounded like our front yard. David, please help me. I'm hurt, and I can't make it home. Catherine gripped my arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength for someone so weakened by illness. They're testing the boundaries, she said, seeing how close they can get to the house, how much they can influence before we react. Through the window, I watched shadows move between the burned-out streetlights, shapes that might have been people, but moved in ways that didn't quite match human movement. The voices continued calling from different directions, creating the impression of multiple people in distress, rather than a single entity trying to lure me outside. Each hour they get a little closer, Catherine said, her voice barely audible above the calling voices. Veskanen, tomorrow night they'll be closer still, and eventually they'll find a way to reach us even inside the house. I realized that my failed escape attempts hadn't just been inconvenient. They'd given the entity time to strengthen its position, to move its hunt closer to our front door. We were no longer just dealing with something that called from the distant woods. We were dealing with something that was systematically closing the distance between us, testing our defenses, preparing for a final assault that would leave me with nowhere to run. The voices started just after midnight. I'd been lying in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to Catherine's labored breathing through the thin walls when the first call drifted through my window. Not the single voice I'd heard before, but multiple voices coming from different directions around the house. Davy boy, where did you go? I can't find you. That was the Jess voice, the one that had started this whole nightmare. But now it had company. David, son, come outside. I need to talk to you. I need to talk to you. My blood went cold. That voice belonged to my father, or at least sounded exactly like him. The same tone he'd used when calling me in for dinner as a kid, the same slight rasp from years of smoking before he quit. Dad had been dead for 5 years, but hearing that familiar voice made my chest tighten with a mixture of grief and terror. Dave, man, what are you doing in there? What are you doing in there? Come on, let's go grab a beer. Jake, my college roommate, the guy who was supposed to drive up yesterday before his car mysteriously broke down. The voice captured his casual way of talking, the slight Chicago accent he'd never quite lost, even the way he always shortened my name to one syllable when he wanted something. I sat up in bed, pressing my back against the headboard and pulling the blanket around my shoulders like it could provide some kind of protection. The voices moved around the house's perimeter, calling from the front yard, then the side, then the back, creating the impression of multiple people surrounding the building. David, please help me. I'm hurt. Catherine's voice. I was on my feet and halfway to the door before my rational mind caught up with my body. Catherine was upstairs in her bedroom, probably asleep or at least trying to rest. I'd heard her breathing through the walls less than an hour ago, but the voice outside sounded exactly like her, down to the way she pronounced my name when she was in pain or distress. I gripped the door handle but didn't turn it, forcing myself to remember what Catherine had told me about the entity's abilities. It could mimic anyone's voice perfectly. Using sounds and inflections it had somehow gathered over decades of watching and listening to the people in this town. The thing calling from our backyard wasn't my mother. It was something that had studied her long enough to copy every detail of how she spoke. David. Oh God, something's wrong. I can't breathe. Please come help me. The Catherine voice became more urgent, more desperate, easebert, adding a gasping quality that made it sound like she was having trouble getting air into her lungs. I knew it was fake, knew it was a trick designed to exploit my protective instincts, but hearing those words in my mother's voice made every muscle in my body tense with the need to run outside and help her. I pressed my forehead against the door, gripping the handle so hard my knuckles went white. My knuckles went white. The rational part of my brain kept repeating that Catherine was upstairs, that this was exactly the kind of manipulation the entity specialized in. That responding would be exactly what it wanted me to do. But the emotional part of my brain, the part that had spent the last 3 days watching my mother struggle with terminal illness, screamed at me to stop wasting time and go help her. Please, David, I'm scared. It hurts so much. The voice was getting weaker, more breathless, like Catherine was losing the ability to call for help. I bit down on my knuckle hard enough to taste blood, using the physical pain to anchor myself to reality. My mother was upstairs. The voice outside was not her. Responding would mean walking into a trap that had been perfected over more than a century of hunting. But knowing all that didn't make it easier to listen to what sounded like Catherine begging for help while I stood frozen in my bedroom, doing nothing. The door handle rattle, rattle. Not the sound of someone trying to turn it from outside, but the violent shaking of something testing the lock mechanism. The whole door vibrated in its frame as whatever was on the other side applied pressure to the handle, the deadbolt, the hinges. The rattling moved to the back door next, then to what sounded like every window on the ground floor. I crept to my bedroom window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to peer out at the street. The burned-out streetlights created pools of shadow between the working ones, and in those dark spaces I could see shapes moving with purpose. Not the random movement of animals or windblown debris, but deliberate motion that suggested coordination and intelligence. A scratching sound started somewhere near the foundation of the house. The noise was rhythmic and methodical, like claws or fingernails being dragged across wood or stone. It began at what sounded like the front corner of the building and moved slowly along the wall toward the side of the house. I followed the sound by moving from window to window, tracking its progress as it traced the entire perimeter of our property. The scratching wasn't random damage. It felt like something was systematically testing the house's defenses, looking for weak spots in the walls or foundation where it might be able to find a way inside. The sound moved around corners with precision, maintaining the same steady rhythm as it mapped every inch of the building's exterior. My breath started fogging. The temperature inside the house had dropped at least 20 degrees in the span of a few minutes, going from comfortable to cold enough that I could see my exhalations as small white clouds. I pulled on a sweatshirt and checked the thermostat in the hallway, but it still showed the same setting Catherine had maintained for weeks. The heating system was running, but it couldn't keep up with whatever was causing the sudden temperature drop. Footsteps creaked on the stairs. Catherine appeared in the hallway wearing her bathrobe over flannel pajamas, moving slowly but with more alertness than I'd seen from her in days. Her face was pale and drawn, but her eyes were sharp and focused as she took in the visible breath fog and the continued scratching sounds coming from outside. "New moon," she said without preamble. I should have realized it was coming. She walked to the living room window and looked out at the street, where the shapes moving between the burned-out streetlights had become more numerous and more bold. Some of them had moved closer to the houses, no longer staying at the tree line, but venturing onto lawns and driveways. The entity draws strength from lunar cycles, Catherine continued, pulling the curtains closed with hands that shook from cold and exhaustion. New moon phases give it the most power, which is why tonight's attack is so much more intense than what you experienced before. The scratching sound completed its circuit around the house and started over again, this time accompanied by a low, scraping noise that suggested whatever was making the marks was applying more pressure. Through the walls, I could hear voices calling from multiple directions, creating an overlapping chorus of familiar people asking for help. Catherine disappeared into the basement and returned carrying a cardboard box that looked like it had been stored for decades. She set it on the coffee table and opened it carefully, revealing a collection of old photographs wrapped in tissue paper. "These are houses that had to be abandoned after prolonged attacks," she said, spreading the photos across the table. Families who couldn't maintain their defenses long enough to outlast the entity's attention. The photographs showed buildings that looked like they'd been clawed by enormous animals. Deep gouges ran along exterior walls from foundation to roofline. Windows were scratched beyond repair. And doors hung off their hinges. Some houses showed damage so extensive that entire sections of wall had been torn away, leaving gaping holes that exposed the interior rooms to the elements. "This is what happens when the entity decides it needs to get inside," Catherine said, pointing to a photo of a house that had been virtually destroyed. "It doesn't usually escalate to this level, but when it targets someone specifically and can't lure them out through normal methods, it adapts its approach." I studied the photographs, trying to imagine the terror the families must have experienced while listening to their homes being systematically destroyed around them. The damage wasn't random. It showed the same methodical approach I was hearing in the scratching sounds currently moving around our house. "How long do the attacks usually last?" I asked. "That depends on how determined the entity is and how well the family can maintain their defenses," Catherine said. "Some people give in after a few nights and walk outside voluntarily. Others hold out for weeks before the psychological pressure becomes unbearable." The voices outside were getting louder, more insistent. I could hear my father calling my name with increasing urgency, Jake asking why I wouldn't come out and talk to him, and the Catherine voice begging for help with breathing that sounded more labored by the minute. "The worst part is that it learns," Catherine continued, gathering the photographs back into their box. "Every night you resist, it gathers more information about what motivates you, what voices you respond to most strongly, what scenarios are most likely to break down your defenses." As if responding to her words, a new voice joined the chorus outside. "David, can you hear me? It's Professor Martinez from your computer science program. I'm here to discuss your thesis project." I'd never mentioned Professor Martinez to Catherine, had never even talked about my specific classes or professors during my visits home. But the entity had somehow learned about him, had gathered enough information to know which authority figures from my college life might compel me to respond. "Tomorrow night will be worse," Catherine said, closing the box of photographs and holding it against her chest like a shield. "And the night after that will be worse still. The entity is preparing for something bigger than just calling your name from the woods. It's testing our defenses because it's planning to find a way inside the house itself." The scratching sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the voices calling from the darkness outside. But the sudden silence felt more ominous than the methodical testing had, like something had finished its reconnaissance and was now planning its next move. Catherine looked toward the windows, where the curtains blocked our view of whatever was moving around our property. Her breathing was more labored than usual, and I could see the effort it took for her to stay upright and alert. "We need to reinforce the basement defenses," she said. "If the entity does try to breach the house, that's our best chance of surviving until dawn." As we headed toward the basement stairs, the temperature dropped another few degrees, and the voices outside began calling our names in perfect unison, creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. Whatever was hunting us had moved beyond simple mimicry and was now demonstrating a level of coordination that suggested intelligence far beyond what I'd imagined. The real attack hadn't even started yet. I woke up on the basement floor next to Catherine. Both of us curled against the concrete wall where spent the night reinforcing the salt lines and checking the iron fixtures that previous generations had installed around the foundation. The voices outside had finally stopped around dawn, but the house still felt unnaturally cold, and my breath formed small clouds in the dim light filtering through the high basement windows. Catherine looked terrible. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made her appear almost translucent. and her breathing came in short-labored gasps that seemed to require enormous effort. She'd been declining steadily over the past few days, but this morning her condition had crossed some invisible line into something that looked genuinely life-threatening. "We need to get you to a hospital," I said, helping her sit up against the wall. "This isn't just the cancer anymore. Something's wrong." Catherine shook her head weakly, pressing one hand against her chest as she struggled to catch her breath. "Can't leave the house," she whispered. "Not anymore. Mom, you're dying. Whatever's outside can't be worse than staying here and letting your condition deteriorate." "It can be," Catherine said, each word requiring visible effort. "The entity's changing its patterns. It used to only hunt at night, but it's been adapting, learning from each generation. The daylight hours aren't safe anymore." She gestured toward the corner of the basement where we discovered several of the salt lines had broken apart on their own during the night, leaving gaps in the protective barriers that had been maintained for decades. The iron fixtures showed signs of corrosion that hadn't been there yesterday, and some of the religious symbols carved into the foundation stones appeared to be fading. "Your father didn't die in a random car accident," Catherine continued, her voice barely audible above her labored breathing. "It happened during the day, on a clear stretch of road he'd driven hundreds of times. No mechanical failure, no other vehicles involved, no medical emergency. The police report said he just drove off the road and hit a tree like he'd suddenly forgotten how to steer." I felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature in the basement. Dad had died 5 years ago, in what everyone had called a tragic accident. The kind of thing that happened to careful drivers who just had a moment of bad luck. I'd never questioned the official explanation because there hadn't been any reason to doubt it. "The entity doesn't just hunt people who break the rules," Catherine said. "It punishes families who know too much, who've seen too much, who pose a threat to its hunting grounds. And your father spent years researching its history, documenting its patterns, trying to find some way to stop it permanently." Catherine struggled to her feet, using the wall for support, and walked to what I'd always assumed was just another section of concrete foundation. She pressed against a particular stone, and an entire section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a room I'd never known existed. The hidden space was maybe 8 feet square, with walls lined with metal shelving that held dozens of containers filled with salt iron nails, blessed water from multiple religious traditions, and what looked like centuries' worth of protective charms and talismans. The floor was covered with an intricate pattern of salt lines that formed geometric shapes I didn't recognize, and the walls were carved with symbols from Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and several other belief systems I couldn't identify. "Every family in Millbrook has something like this," Catherine said, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "Protections that have been maintained for generations, passed down from parents to children who grew up knowing that their survival depended on keeping these barriers intact." I examined the shelving more closely and found bottles of water labeled with dates going back to the 1920s, each one blessed by different religious leaders who had understood the nature of what they were protecting against. Iron tools hung from hooks on the walls, horseshoes, railroad spikes, old keys, all arranged in patterns that suggested both practical use and symbolic meaning. "But it's not working anymore," Catherine continued, pointing to sections of salt line that showed the same spontaneous breaks we'd found upstairs. "The entity grows stronger with each decade, each generation it successfully hunts. The protections that kept our grandparents safe aren't enough to keep us safe." I picked up a journal from one of the shelves and opened it to find handwritten entries dating back to the 1940s, documenting the entity's behavior patterns, its preferred hunting methods, the times of year when its activity increased. Later entries showed a gradual escalation, longer hunting periods, more sophisticated mimicry, the ability to influence mechanical systems and communication networks. "This is why your father was trying to find a permanent solution," Catherine said. "He knew that eventually the entity would become too powerful for the traditional defenses to contain. He thought maybe if he could understand its origin better, learn more about the woman who cursed the Blackwood family, he might find a way to break the cycle permanently." Catherine sat down heavily on a wooden crate, her breathing becoming more erratic. "Kyo? The night before he died, he told me he'd found something in the old records, something about how the curse could be broken. But he never had the chance to explain what he discovered. The implications hit me like physical weight. My father hadn't died because of bad luck or momentary inattention. He'd been killed because he'd gotten too close to information that threatened the entity's ability to continue hunting. And now that same entity was systematically closing off every escape route I tried to use, trapping me in the same house where my father had conducted his research. "If something happens to me," Catherine said, gripping my arm with surprising strength, "you have to leave immediately. Don't wait for funeral arrangements. Don't try to settle my affairs. Don't worry about anything except getting out of this town as fast as possible." "Nothing's going to happen to you," I said, though I could see how pale she'd become, how much effort each breath required. "Promise me," Catherine insisted. "The entity gets stronger when it successfully takes someone, and it gets strongest of all when it takes someone who knows the truth. If I die while you're still here, it'll have enough power to hunt you even during daylight hours, even if you never leave the house." I helped Catherine back upstairs, noting how she had to stop twice to rest on the stairway. Her breathing sounded wet and ragged, and I could feel heat radiating from her skin that suggested fever had joined whatever other symptoms were attacking her system. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of checking on Catherine every few minutes, trying to convince her to let me call a doctor, and watching the street outside for any signs that the entity's influence extended beyond the nighttime hours. The neighborhood looked normal. Mrs. Henderson working in her garden, the mail truck making its rounds, kids riding bikes on the sidewalk. But I found myself studying every shadow, every movement, looking for evidence that the rules had changed. Catherine spent most of the day dozing fitfully on the living room couch, waking periodically to check the windows and make sure all the doors remained locked. She refused offers of food and could barely manage a few sips of water without breaking into coughing fits that left her exhausted. As afternoon shifted toward evening, Catherine became increasingly agitated. She kept turning toward the windows as if hearing sounds I couldn't detect, and her eyes would track movement that wasn't there. "Do you hear that?" she asked during one of these episodes, gripping the blanket I had draped over her legs. Listened carefully, but heard only the normal sounds of a neighborhood settling into evening routines. "What do you hear?" "It's calling my name," Catherine whispered. "It knows I'm weakened. It's trying to use that against both of us." The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Catherine's agitation increased as the light faded, and she started responding to voices that I couldn't hear, sometimes nodding as if agreeing to something, sometimes shaking her head and whispering no under her breath. Her voice taking on a confused quality that scared me more than her physical symptoms had. "It says you went out to get help for me, but you got lost and you need me to come find you." I knelt beside the couch and took her hand, which felt burning hot against my skin. "I haven't left the house. Whatever you're hearing isn't real." Catherine looked at me with eyes that seemed to be having trouble focusing. "But I can hear you calling for me. You sound scared, David. You sound like you need help. The entity wasn't just testing the house's physical defenses anymore. It was exploiting Catherine's weakened mental state, trying to use her illness and confusion to break down the psychological barriers that had kept our family safe for decades." And as the room grew darker with each passing minute, I realized that tonight was going to be even worse than the night before. Catherine stopped breathing at 12:17 a.m. I'd been dozing in the chair beside her couch, jerking awake every few minutes to check on her, when I realized the room had gone completely quiet. No more labored breathing, no more restless shifting under the blanket, no more whispered responses to voices only she could hear, just silence. I reached for her wrist, searching for a pulse I already knew I wouldn't find. Her skin felt cool under my fingers, and her face had relaxed into an expression of peace I hadn't seen from her in weeks. Whatever pain had been eating away at her from the inside was finally gone. The voices outside started screaming before I'd even let go of her hand. Not the patient, pleading calls I'd grown used to over the past few nights, but urgent, desperate shrieks that came from multiple directions around the house. The entity knew. Somehow it had sensed the exact moment Catherine's protection disappeared. And it was responding with a fury that made the windows rattle in their frames. "David! David, where are you?" The voice belonged to Catherine, but louder and more demanding than she'd ever been in life. It came from the front yard, then immediately from the backyard, as if multiple versions of her were surrounding the house and calling for me simultaneously. I pulled the blanket up over Catherine's face, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the simple gesture. Whatever barriers had protected this house for generations, whatever power her presence had maintained to keep the entity at bay, was already starting to crumble. The temperature plummeted. I could see my breath forming white clouds in the living room air, and frost began appearing on the inside of the windows despite the heating system running at full capacity. The sudden cold felt aggressive, purposeful, like something was systematically draining all warmth from the house. Thus, I stumbled toward the basement stairs, needing to check on the salt lines Catherine had shown me. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, but underneath that familiar sound I could hear something else. A low grinding noise that seemed to be coming from inside the walls themselves. The salt lines were disintegrating, not just breaking apart the way they had over the past few nights, but actually dissolving, leaving behind only faint white traces where solid barriers had existed an hour earlier. The iron fixtures were corroding so rapidly I could watch rust spreading across their surfaces in real time. The protective symbols carved into the foundation stones were fading as if someone was slowly erasing them. "David, please help me. I'm hurt." Catherine's voice again, but now it was coming from directly outside the house, though it seemed to echo through the walls as if she was somehow speaking from multiple locations at once. The tone was exactly right, the same mixture of pain and determination she'd used when her illness flared up, but she was trying not to worry me. I fell down outside. I can't get back up. "Please come help me." I pressed my back against the basement wall, forcing myself to remember that Catherine was dead. Whatever was speaking with her voice was the same entity that had been hunting me for days. But hearing her ask for help in the exact way she would have if she'd actually been in trouble made every protective instinct I had scream at me to run upstairs and find her. The grinding noise inside the walls grew louder, accompanied by a scraping sound that suggested something with claws was moving through the spaces between rooms. The entity wasn't just testing the house's defenses anymore. It was actively destroying them, using whatever power Catherine's death had given it to dismantle protections that had held for decades. I opened the hidden room Catherine had shown me and grabbed the journal with entries dating back to the 1940s. If there was any information about what to do when the primary defenses failed, it would be documented somewhere in the generations of notes her family had maintained. The entries from the early decades were mostly routine observations about hunting patterns and seasonal variations. But as I flipped toward the more recent pages, I found increasingly desperate accounts of families who had lost their primary protectors and faced the entity alone. 1987, Margaret Kowalski passed during the new moon phase. Her son reported complete barrier failure within hours. Entity gained house access on the third night. Family abandoned property and relocated to Michigan. House remained uninhabitable. 1995. Robert Chen died of heart attack while Entity was actively hunting his daughter. Protective measures collapsed immediately. Entity entered home within 48 hours. End of FO's. Daughter survived by barricading in safe room but suffered severe psychological trauma before rescue. The pattern was clear and terrifying. When the primary family protector died, especially during an active hunting period, the entity gained exponentially more power and could breach defenses that had previously been impenetrable. "David, why won't you answer me? I'm scared." The Catherine voice was closer now, seeming to come from just outside the basement windows. I could hear what sounded like footsteps moving around the ground floor above me, but I knew it had to be the house itself responding to the entity's presence. Boards settling, pipes expanding, the building structure reacting to the supernatural force that was systematically dismantling its protections. I kept reading, looking for any entry that mentioned successful resistance rather than evacuation. Most families simply ran when their defenses collapsed, but a few had found ways to fight back. One entry from 1952 caught my attention. I heard the front door unlock. Not the sound of someone using a key or picking the lock, but the metallic click of the deadbolt retracting on its own, followed by the slow creak of the door swinging open on its hinges. The entity had finally gained enough power to manipulate the physical barriers that had kept it outside. David, are you upstairs? Catherine's voice, perfectly mimicking the concerned tone she'd used when checking on me as a child, the sound seemed to move through the house above me. Though whether it was the entity's voice or some kind of supernatural echo, I couldn't tell. The acoustics were wrong, too clear, too present, missing the natural muffling that should have occurred between floors. I grabbed several containers of salt from the hidden room shelves and quickly reinforced the lines around the basement entrance, but the white crystals started dissolving as soon as I poured them. Whatever power the entity had gained from Catherine's death was strong enough to neutralize protections that had worked for generations. The presence moved to the second floor. David, where are you hiding? I need to tell you something important. Room by room, the entity searched the upstairs and I could hear doors opening and closing, the sound of someone checking spaces where I might have taken shelter. The Catherine voice called my name from my childhood bedroom, then from her room, then from the bathroom, each time with increasing urgency. I retreated into the hidden room and pulled the concealed door closed behind me, but I could still hear the methodical search continuing overhead. The entity knew I was in the house somewhere, and it had all night to find me. The presence came down to the basement. I could sense it moving across the concrete floor, pausing at each corner and alcove. The Catherine voice continued calling my name, but now it carried an edge of frustration that my real mother never would have used. I know you're down here, David. Stop hiding from me. The presence stopped directly outside the hidden room. Through the concealed door, I could hear what sounded like breathing, slow, deliberate inhalations that suggested something standing inches away from where I crouched in the darkness. A scratching sound started on the other side of the wall. Methodical, persistent scratching as if something with claws was testing the hidden door's concealment. The entity had found the room's location and was now trying to figure out how to access it. I opened the journal again, looking for more details about the Blackwood artifacts and the cemetery location, Unho, Za. The 1952 entry mentioned Section 12, near the back of the grounds where the oldest graves were located. The artifacts had been buried in a metal box, 3 feet down, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and decay. Inside, I found personal items that had belonged to the original family. A woman's jewelry, a man's pocket watch, children's toys, and several pieces of carved bone that might have been used for some kind of ritual purpose. I arranged the artifacts in a pile on top of the grave and doused them with lighter fluid. The sun was just beginning to appear above the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds. According to the journal entry, the fire had to be lit between dawn and noon, and dawn was close enough. The match caught on the first strike, and I dropped it onto the pile of artifacts. The flames spread quickly, burning much hotter and brighter than they should have given the amount of lighter fluid I'd used. The artifacts didn't just burn. They seemed to dissolve in the fire, leaving behind no ash or residue. The air above the flames shimmered like heat waves, and I felt a sudden pressure release, as if something that had been pressing down on the entire town for generations had suddenly lifted. The oppressive feeling that had haunted Millbrook for as long as I could remember was gone. I drove back to the house to collect Catherine's body and my belongings, but the urgency I'd felt for the past week had completely disappeared. The streets looked normal again. The shadows between buildings no longer seemed threatening, and the woods behind our house were just woods. Trees and underbrush, nothing more. Catherine was exactly where I'd left her, peaceful under the blanket I'd pulled over her face. I called the funeral home from the kitchen phone, made arrangements for her body to be picked up, and packed the rest of my belongings into my duffel bag. By noon, I was driving out of Millbrook for the last time, watching the town shrink in my rearview mirror, until it disappeared completely behind the hills that had always surrounded it. But as I reached the county line, I thought about the journal entry that had saved my life. The banishment effect lasted 6-8 months before the entity regenerated full strength. By next winter, someone else would hear familiar voices calling from the woods after dark, and the cycle would begin again. The solution I'd found wasn't permanent. It was just a reprieve. The darkness that had taken root in Millbrook more than a century ago could be pushed back temporarily, but it could never be completely destroyed. The town would need a new generation to maintain the vigil, to keep the rules, to protect their children from the thing that waited in the spaces between memory and nightmare. I kept driving, but I knew I'd carry that knowledge with me forever. The understanding that some evils were too deeply rooted to be eliminated only contained. And somewhere behind me in a town that would soon forget I'd ever existed, the countdown to the entity's return had already begun.